All right, so today we're going to take a bit of a philosophical turn.
Oh,
Yeah, but more like practical philosophy.
you know,
Like we're going to be looking at some really basic questions about making choices.
decisions.
Exactly. How do you choose well?
Yeah.
Especially when you don't have like a crystal ball or, one of those supercomputers for a brain.
Ah, yes, the classic dilemma of being human.
Well, that's exactly what we're going to be diving into today. And for this deep dive, we've got a really fascinating source to work with, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy's entry on
Bounded rationality.
bounded rationality. And what's really cool is that this entry brings together perspectives from like a ton of different fields. So we've got psychology, economics, even computer science and biology, all trying to understand how we make decisions.
Yeah, it's a real melting pot of ideas.
And all of it is focused on this core idea.
Mm-hmm.
How do you make good choices when you don't have perfect information and when you're working with, a regular human brain? So forget that idea of like perfectly rational economic man that we often hear about.
Spock.
Exactly. It turns out that model doesn't really reflect how any of us actually make choices.
Not even Spock.
So our mission today is to really understand these alternative ideas about decision-making, what's called bounded rationality, and unpack what that actually means for how you make decisions every single day.
All right, so let's start by looking at where a lot of this thinking began,
Hmm.
with the idea of perfect rationality.
That mythical creature.
Right, and this idea is often personified literally in the figure of Homo economicus.
Economic man.
Economic man indeed, the perfectly rational agent.
Okay, so take us back in time a bit. When did this idea even show up?
Well, the encyclopedia points out that this isn't a static concept. It's evolved quite a bit over time. Early thinkers like John Stuart Mill, they imagine this agent as being purely self-interested, always trying to maximize their own personal gain.
So like the ultimate selfish jerk?
Well, in a purely economic sense.
Okay.
Then later, folks like Jevons came along and formalized things with the idea of marginal utility, focusing more specifically on the economic behavior of the consumer.
So how much satisfaction do you get from each additional slice of pizza?
Exactly. And then Frank Knight added the concept of perfect foresight to the mix, this idea that economic man could perfectly anticipate all future events and risks, like a perfect gambler.
Yeah, when you put it that way, it starts to sound a lot less like a human being and a lot more like some kind of perfectly calibrated machine.
Well, that's part of the point the encyclopedia makes.
Right.
But the modern view of Homo economicus really solidified with Samuelson's revealed preference theory, the idea that we can understand preferences simply by observing what people actually choose.
So actions speak louder than words.
Exactly. And then, of course, there's the work of von Neumann and Morgenstern on expected utility theory.
Ah, yes, the dynamic duo of decision theory.
Indeed. What's fascinating here is that the focus shifted away from the actual reasoning behind your choices and more towards the choices themselves.
Like, it doesn't matter why you picked the chocolate cake, just that you did.
Right. And expected utility theory basically says that a perfectly rational person, our old friend, Homo economicus, will always choose the option that maximizes their expected benefit based on a flawless assessment of both outcomes and probabilities.
So, like, they can see all the possible futures and know exactly which one is most likely.
Right, and they have perfectly consistent references, so they're never swayed by emotions or biases or, Monday morning brain fog.
Okay, but as we've been hinting at, this perfectly rational agent sounds a bit too perfect, right?
Well, that's because it is.
Because it is.
The real world is a lot messier than that.
Yes, it is.
And that brings us to the core concept of bounded rationality.
Okay, so walk us through that. What exactly does it mean to be boundedly rational?
The term was coined by Herbert Simon, and it was basically his way of saying, hey, we need to stop pretending that people are these perfectly rational calculators.
Because we're not.
Exactly. He argued that a truly useful conception of rationality needs to actually fit the amount of information we have access to.
Which, let's be honest, is rarely all of it.
Right. And it also has to fit the cognitive abilities that we actually possess as humans. We have to work with the brains we've got.
Okay, so bounded rationality isn't just about acknowledging that we're not perfect. It's a whole set of ideas and approaches that try to explain how we actually manage to function effectively despite those limitations.
Precisely. And this leads to some very interesting observations about how our real-world decision-making actually deviates from that classic expected utility theory.
Okay, so let's talk about some of these cracks in the foundation of perfect rationality.
Cracks indeed. So one of the first areas where things get interesting is with what's called the ordering axiom.
The ordering axiom.
Yeah, basically this axiom says that for any two options, you either prefer one over the other, you're indifferent, or you just don't know.
You're just like, Hey.
Yeah, basically.
Hmm.
And philosophers and economists started asking, what happens if we drop that assumption that you always have a clear preference?
So what happens when you factor in indecision?
Exactly. Thinkers like Keynes and Knight actually thought this was a crucial part of understanding economic behavior in the real world.
So it's not necessarily irrational for you to just be like, I don't know which one I like better.
Precisely. And early work by people like Amen formalized this mathematically, showing how you can reason about situations where people's preferences might be incomplete.
Okay, that makes sense. We're always trying to figure out what other people want, and sometimes even they don't know.
Right.
But what about the other part of the ordering axiom transitivity? Isn't that supposed to be like a fundamental rule of rational choice?
Yes. Traditionally, the idea is that if you prefer option A to option B and option B to option C, then you should also always prefer option A to option C.
Yeah, like apples, bananas, oranges.
Exactly. And any violation of that has typically been seen as like a major red flag of irrationality.
Mm.
But when philosophers and psychologists started looking at the evidence more closely, it wasn't so clear cut.
So what are they finding?
Well, sometimes what appears to be a violation of transitivity might just be that your preferences are changing over time, not that you're being inconsistent at a single point in time.
Like what I want for dinner tonight might be totally different from what I'll want tomorrow.
Exactly. And there are even arguments that in dynamic situations, acting in a way that isn't strictly transitive in the short term could actually be the most rational thing to do if it helps you achieve better outcomes in the long run.
So it's like taking a detour that seems longer, but actually gets you where you need to go faster.
That's a great analogy.
Okay, what about the Archimedean axiom? That one sounds a bit more like abstract math. How does that relate to like your everyday decisions?
Well, getting rid of this axiom allows for what are called lexicographic preferences.
The lexicographic.
Yeah, it's like a dictionary. Words are ordered first by their first letter, then by their second letter, and so on. So, in terms of choices, it means there might be one dimension that's so important to you that no amount of improvement on other dimensions could ever make you change your mind.
So it's like a non-negotiable deal breaker.
Exactly. Like for some people, safety might be so incredibly important that no amount of luxury features in a car would ever convince them to buy a less safe model. Safety trumps everything else.
Okay, so it's like saying, I don't care how many bells and whistles it has. If it's not safe, I'm not buying it.
Precisely. And this idea has some really interesting implications. It helps to explain why you might stick with a choice even when it seems like there are objectively better options available.
Because maybe there's that one crucial factor that outweighs everything else.
Right. And it also connects to those non-compensatory decision models like take the best that the encyclopedia talks about.
Take the best. So tell me how that works.
So these models are all about simplifying your choices. Instead of trying to weigh all the different factors perfectly, you just focus on the most important one and make your decision based on that.
That sounds pretty efficient. So you're basically creating a hierarchy of decision criteria, and then you just go down the list until you find the one that's decisive.
Exactly. It's a very streamlined way of making choices.
Okay, so we've tackled two of the big three axioms, ordering and Archimedean. What about the last one, the independence axiom? Why has that been questioned?
Ah, yes, the independence axiom. This one is all about how your preferences between two options shouldn't change if you combine them both with the same irrelevant third option.
Okay, that sounds pretty abstract. Can you give me an example of what that would look like in the real world?
Sure, imagine you're choosing between two vacation packages, one to Hawaii and one to Italy. Now imagine a third option is added, a free travel guide to either destination.
Okay.
The independence axiom says that your preference between Hawaii and Italy shouldn't change just because you now also get a free travel guide with both options.
It's like saying the travel guide shouldn't influence your fundamental preference between the two trips.
Exactly. But real-world observations of how people actually make choices often violate this axiom.
So we don't always act so logically.
Well, it's not necessarily about logic. It's more about how our emotions and psychological biases can sometimes influence our choices.
Okay, give me an example.
Well, a classic one is the principle of loss aversion. For most people, the pain of losing something is actually felt more strongly than the pleasure of gaining something of equal value.
So it hurts more to lose $10 than it feels good to find $10.
Exactly. And this can lead to all sorts of interesting behavioral patterns, like the endowment effect, where you tend to value something you already own more highly simply because it's yours.
Oh yeah, I've definitely experienced
It's
that.
a very common human bias.
Okay, so our feelings about potential losses in games can actually override a purely rational calculation of the odds.
That's right. And this realization has led to the development of some fascinating alternative theories of decision making, like prospect theory, regret theory, and rank dependent expected utility theory.
Those sound pretty complicated.
They are. But they basically all try to create more realistic models of how people actually make choices by taking these psychological biases into account.
So they're acknowledging that we're not just these cold calculating machines.
Exactly. And this brings us back to Herbert Simon and his critique of the whole economic man idea.
So what was Simon's main point?
Well, he felt that simply focusing on the final choice someone makes, like classical economics, did completely miss a crucial part of the equation, the actual process of decision making.
So it's not just what you choose, but how you get there.
Precisely. And this is where he introduced the concept of procedural rationality.
Procedural rationality.
Right. It's basically about how you manage the trade-off between the mental effort in making a decision and the quality or accuracy of that decision.
So like the more effort you put in, the better the outcome should be, but also the
Yeah.
more tiring it is.
Exactly. It's all about finding that sweet spot.
The accuracy effort trade-off. Yeah, I definitely relate to that.
And from a bounded rationality perspective, we can view this as a kind of constrained optimization. You're still trying to make the best decision, but you're doing it within the limits of your own thinking abilities and the time you have available.
Right, because none of us have infinite time and energy to devote to every single decision we make.
Exactly. So Simon argued that instead of always striving for the absolute best option, people often use simpler decision rules like satisficing.
Satisfying. Instead of looking for the absolute best, you just look for something that's good enough.
Precisely. You consider your options until you find one that meets a certain acceptable threshold.
So you're setting a bar for yourself, and once you find something that clears it, you're good to go.
That's the basic idea. And this concept has been applied to a wide range of human behaviors, from choosing a job to finding a romantic partner.
So it's not just about buying a toaster.
Not at all.
What about Selton's aspiration adaptation theory and level lake thinking? Are those also related to this idea of satisficing?
They are. So aspiration adaptation theory looks at situations where you have multiple goals that might not be directly comparable. Instead of trying to find one perfect solution that maximizes everything, you set aspiration levels for each goal, and those levels can actually adjust based on what's realistically achievable.
So it's like saying, okay, I want a job that pays this much, is this close to home, and allows me to do work I enjoy, but I might have to compromise on one or two of those things depending on what's out there.
Exactly. It's about being flexible and adapting your goals to the constraints of the situation.
Okay. And what about level K thinking?
So level K thinking is all about strategic decision making. It's about trying to predict what other people will do in a given situation.
Oh, so it's like playing chess, but with real people.
Sort of, but instead of assuming that everyone is capable of perfectly anticipating each other's moves infinitely into the future, level-like thinking says that people only go through a limited number of steps of reasoning about what others are thinking.
So it's like, I think that she thinks that I think that she thinks. And at some point, you just have to stop.
Exactly. It's a much more realistic model of how we actually reason about other people's actions.
Okay. And Encyclopedia also mentions this concept of proper versus improper linear models.
Yeah.
How does that fit into how we make decisions?
Well, this idea really highlights how sometimes simpler decision rules can actually outperform more complex ones. A proper linear model would be like statistically weighing different factors to come up with a precise prediction.
So, like, if you were trying to predict which job applicant would be the most successful, you'd create a model that takes into account their experience, education, interview performance, and so on.
Exactly. And you'd use statistics to figure out how much weight to give each factor.
Okay, but what's an improper model then?
An improper model might just give each factor an equal weight or even just a +1 or -1, depending on whether it's seen as positive or negative.
So it's a much more simplified approach.
Right. And what's fascinating is that these simpler models sometimes do a better job of predicting outcomes than human experts, and sometimes even almost as well as those fancy statistical models.
Really? So why would a simpler model be better?
Well, it seems like these simpler models might be more robust. They're less likely to be swayed by random variations in the data. And sometimes just focusing on choosing the right factors is more important than getting their precise weights perfect.
So it's about picking your battles.
Exactly.
Okay, the next big topic in the encyclopedia is ecological rationality. What's the key idea here?
So with ecological rationality, the focus shifts from your internal thought processes to the environment in which you're making those decisions.
So it's not just about how you think, it's about the context in which you're thinking.
Exactly. The idea is that the rationality of a decision strategy isn't just about how logically sound it is in the abstract, but how well it's adapted to the specific situation you're in.
So a strategy that works great in one situation might be a total disaster in another.
Precisely. And the encyclopedia mentions Brunswick's lens model here, which is a framework for thinking about how we use cues in our environment to make inferences about things we can't directly observe.
Can you give me an example?
Sure, imagine you're walking down a dark street and you hear footsteps behind you. You might interpret that as a sign of danger, even though you can't actually see who's there.
Okay, that makes sense.
So the lens model is all about understanding how we use these cues to make judgments about the world around us.
And how accurate those judgments are.
Exactly. And ecological rationality emphasizes that the reliability of these cues can vary depending on the environment.
So the footsteps might be more concerning in a deserted alley than on a busy street.
Right. And then there's the concept of rational analysis, which is a way of thinking about cognition that assumes our minds have been shaped by evolution and learning to be well suited to the environments we typically encounter.
So it's about understanding why certain behaviors might be adaptive in certain situations.
Exactly. For example, research in this area has suggested that even forgetting some things might be beneficial because it allows us to focus on the most important information.
So a leaky memory might actually be a feature, not a bug.
In some cases, yes. And then there's cultural adaptation, which highlights how we can quickly learn effective behaviors by observing and imitating others in our social groups.
So it's like social learning.
That's right. It's a very powerful way to adapt, but it also means that we can sometimes pick up less than ideal behaviors if we're not careful.
So there's a trade-off there.
There always is.
Okay, so we've been talking about how our limitations can actually shape our decision-making in interesting ways. But the encyclopedia takes this a step further with a section called Better with Bounds. What are some examples of how our limitations can actually be beneficial?
This is where things get really counterintuitive. So one example is how dealing with small amounts of information can sometimes be more effective than having a ton of data.
Really? That doesn't seem right. More information should always be better, right?
Well, not necessarily.
Yeah.
Especially when you have limited memory, small samples can actually make patterns stand out more clearly, which can speed up learning.
So it's like seeing the signal through the noise.
Exactly. And game theory offers another great example. Traditional game theory often has trouble explaining why people cooperate, because a perfectly self-interested agent should always try to exploit others.
Right, like taking all the candy and running.
All right, but when you factor in the limitations of human cognition, it starts to make sense why cooperation might evolve. Because in the real world, we don't have perfect information about other people's intentions.
So we have to rely on things like trust and reputation.
That's right. And simpler, more cooperative strategies like tit for tat often turn out to be very successful.
Tit for tat.
Yeah, it's basically just do unto others as they do unto you.
Aha, the golden rule.
Exactly. It's a simple rule, but it works surprisingly well.
And then there are those less is more effects that we talked about earlier, where simpler heuristics can actually lead to better outcomes than more complex models.
Right. Sometimes trying to be too clever can backfire. And even the seemingly obvious principle of always wanting more information can have downsides.
Really? Why would you not want more information?
Well, imagine you're in a negotiation. Sometimes knowing too much about the other person's position can actually make it harder to reach a mutually beneficial agreement.
So a little bit of ignorance can be bliss?
In some situations, yes. And then there's the really mind-blowing idea that all rationality is ultimately bounded by the laws of physics.
Whoa, okay, explain that one.
So it turns out that information processing requires energy. And according to the laws of thermodynamics, there's a fundamental limit to how much energy can be used to perform computations.
So even if we had perfect algorithms, our ability to think rationally would still be limited by the amount of energy available.
Exactly. It's a really profound idea.
Okay, so given all these limitations, how have researchers tried to study the ways in which we actually make decisions?
Well, the encyclopedia highlights two main approaches: Kahneman and Tversky's Biases and Heuristics program, and Gigerenzer's Fast and Frugal Heuristics program.
So both of these approaches acknowledge that we use mental shortcuts heuristics to make decisions, but they have different views on whether those shortcuts are generally helpful or harmful.
Exactly. Kahneman and Tversky focused on how heuristics can lead us astray, causing us to make systematic errors or biases in our judgments.
So they were interested in the ways in which our thinking can be irrational.
Right. They identified many common cognitive biases, like the availability heuristic, where we tend to overestimate the likelihood of events that are easy to recall.
Like if you just saw a news report about a shark attack, you might be more afraid of swimming in the ocean, even though the actual risk is very low.
Exactly. But G. Drender's approach emphasizes that these heuristics can often be surprisingly effective in the real world. He argues that they're adapted to specific environments and can lead to good decisions quickly and efficiently.
So it's not that our brains are fundamentally flawed, it's that we're using the wrong tools for the job sometimes.
That's part of G. Drender's argument. He sees these heuristics as being like specialized tools that work well in certain situations, but not in others.
Okay, and the encyclopedia also brings in Amon's arguments for bounded rationality. Can you summarize those for us?
Sure. So Amen laid out 5 main reasons why we should embrace the idea of bounded rationality.
Okay, let's hear them.
All right. First, he argued that even in simple situations, people don't always behave as if they're trying to maximize their gains. Second, he pointed out that the complexity of many real-world problems makes it impossible for us to calculate the optimal solution even if we wanted to. Third, he highlighted how experiments consistently show that people's actual choices violate the predictions of expected utility theory. Fourth, he noted that predictions based on perfectly rational models often don't match real-world behavior. And finally, he argued that sometimes what seems rational according to a theoretical model can lead to outcomes that are undesirable or even absurd in practice.
So it's a pretty strong case against the idea that we're all perfectly rational agents.
That's right, and these points touch on many of the ideas we've already discussed, from the limitations of our cognitive abilities to the influence of emotions and the importance of the environment.
Okay, so this all raises a really fundamental question.
Mm.
What do we even mean when we talk about rationality? The encyclopedia explores a number of different ways to think about this concept.
Right. And this is really important to keep in mind. The word rationality can actually have a lot of different meanings. It can refer to logical consistency, to effectiveness in achieving goals, to how we update our beliefs in light of new evidence, and so on.
So there's not just one right way to be rational.
Not at all. And when we talk about bounded rationality, we're often grappling with the tension between different conceptions of rationality. Like, do we prioritize making logically consistent choices, or do we focus on making choices that lead to good outcomes?
So those two things aren't always the same.
Exactly. And the encyclopedia uses the example of evaluating a prediction to illustrate this point. Like, imagine you're trying to predict whether it will rain tomorrow.
Yeah.
You could prioritize being accurate whenever you make a prediction, or you could prioritize being right as often as possible, even if that means making some incorrect predictions along the way.
So it's like the difference between being precise and being accurate.
Sort of. It depends on what you're trying to achieve.
Okay, and finally, the encyclopedia touches on this interesting idea of the perception-cognition gap. What's that all about?
So this is the observation that humans seem remarkably good at low-level tasks like perceiving and moving, but often struggle with higher-level cognitive tasks like abstract reasoning and decision-making.
So we're great at catching a ball, but not so great at planning our retirement.
That's the basic idea. And there are different views on why this gap exists. Some researchers think that we use fundamentally different kinds of strategies for these different types of tasks, while others argue that the gap might be smaller than it seems and could be partly an artifact of how we study these abilities.
So maybe we're not as bad at higher-level thinking as we think we are.
That's a possibility. And some research suggests that when we compare performance using similar methods, the difference between low-level and high-level abilities might not be as dramatic as we once thought.
Okay, so to wrap things up, acting as philosophers when it comes to our own decision-making means acknowledging that there's no one-size-fits-all solution.
Absolutely. There's no magic formula.
Right. The best approach depends on your goals, the environment you're in, and your available mental resources.
And how you define good in the first place.
Exactly. So understanding these different models of bounded rationality and the various meanings of rationality can help you to be a more thoughtful and effective decision-maker in your own life.
And hopefully it will also make you a little more forgiving of yourself and others when we inevitably make mistakes.
Mistakes are part of the process.
They are indeed.
So as we wrap up this deep dive, we'd like to leave you with a final philosophical question to ponder. In a world that's becoming increasingly complex and information-rich, how should our understanding of what constitutes a good decision evolve?
It's a question worth thinking about, and we encourage you to continue exploring these fascinating ideas of bounded rationality heuristics and the philosophy of decision-making.
Thanks for joining us in this deep dive into bounded rationality.
It's been a pleasure.
Until next time, keep those brains bounded but brilliant.
And remember, good enough is often good enough.
All right, we'll see you next time.
Take care.